Dearest listeners, one might venture to say that the most scandalous moments in society often occur at the very altars where sacred vows are meant to be exchanged. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of a bride who discovered, mere moments before becoming a wife, that the gentleman she thought she knew harbored secrets darker than any Gothic novel might dare imagine. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. The April sun of 1817 pierced through the tall windows of Morton House in Grosvenor Square, painting ribbons of gold across the Persian carpet whose rich crimsons and deep blues seemed to pulse with life in the morning light. Miss Marianne Morton sat with her embroidery, though her needle had not moved for the past quarter hour. At 22, she possessed that particular combination of beauty and intelligence that made her both sought after and slightly feared in the drawing rooms of London. Her auburn hair, swept up and secured with pearl-headed pins in elaborate braids à la grecque, caught the light like burnished copper, while her eyes, those remarkable green eyes that shifted from jade to emerald with her moods, gazed unseeing at the half-finished roses blooming beneath her fingers. The scent of beeswax and lavender oil permeated the morning room, mingling with the faint aroma of coal smoke that even the finest houses could not entirely banish. Outside, the clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones created a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant cries of street vendors hawking their wares. The season of 1817 had begun with all its usual pageantry and promise, yet Marianne found herself increasingly disenchanted with the endless parade of insipid conversations about weather and watercolors. Her father, Sir Edmund Morton, had earned his baronetcy through a combination of shrewd India trade investments and calculated philanthropy. £5,000 to the Foundling Hospital had worked wonders for their social standing. Society accepted them, naturally, for money possessed a remarkable ability to unlock even Almac's hallowed doors. Yet Marianne remained acutely aware of the subtle distinctions, the way certain matrons would pause infinitesimally before acknowledging her mother, the careful phrasing that placed them among the new families rather than simply families. Lady Morton entered with a rustle of bombazine that announced her presence before she crossed the threshold. She had married above her merchant origins and now devoted every waking moment to ensuring her daughter would climb even higher. Her sharp eyes catalogued Marianne's appearance, posture, complexion, the set of her shoulders, with the intensity of a general reviewing battle plans. The morning room itself betrayed their careful navigation of social waters. The furniture, though exquisite, bore the uniformity of recent purchase rather than the pleasant hodgepodge of inherited pieces. The portraits adorning the silk-covered walls depicted only the current generation, painted by fashionable artists rather than inherited masters. The library visible through the open door contained volumes whose gilt lettering gleamed suspiciously bright, lacking the worn patina of generations of readers. These details, invisible to casual observers, marked the Mortons as arrivals rather than fixtures in the landscape of the ton. Sir Edmund possessed that particular brand of pragmatism essential to men who had built their own fortunes. Behind his carefully cultivated facade of genteel respectability beat the heart of a trader who could calculate profit margins while discussing Wordsworth. He understood that his daughter's beauty, combined with his considerable fortune, could secure an alliance with one of England's ancient families, thereby cementing their position for generations to come. Yet when he looked at Marianne, his stern features would soften imperceptibly, a father's affection warring with mercantile ambition. That particular morning brought an invitation that would alter everything, though none could have foreseen it. The cream-colored card, so thick it barely bent, bore the Blackwood crest embossed in gold. The Earl of Blackwood, that reclusive pillar of the old guard, was hosting a ball at his Berkeley Square mansion. The Mortons had secured their place on the guest list through a carefully orchestrated campaign. Lady Morton's cultivation of the Earl's younger sister, Lady Pemberton, combined with Sir Edmund's generous support of the Earl's pet charity for naval veterans. Marianne turned the invitation over in her fingers, feeling the weight of quality paper that spoke of centuries-old traditions. The Blackwood Ball would be the event of the early season. The Earl himself, approaching his 80th year, rarely entertained on such a scale. Drawing rooms across Mayfair buzzed with speculation about his motivations. The prevailing theory, whispered behind fans at every gathering, suggested he intended to formally present his heir. A nephew recently returned from managing the family's extensive West Indies holdings. The whispers surrounding this mysterious heir had taken on mythic proportions. Lord Jonathan Blackwood, as society had learned to call him, had departed for Jamaica 15 years prior, a boy of barely 16. The circumstances of his departure remained shrouded in the kind of deliberate vagueness that suggested scandal. Some claimed a youthful indiscretion. Others hinted at family disagreements. What intrigued society most were the reports filtering back from the Caribbean, tales of unconventional methods, dangerous conflicts with neighboring planters, and a fierce stance against certain unsavory practices that still flourished despite Parliament's recent legislation. The preparations for the ball consumed the Morton household like a fever. Madame Delacroix, whose Bond Street establishment catered only to the most exclusive clientele, had been commissioned to create something extraordinary. After much deliberation, they had settled on celestial blue silk imported from Lyon at shocking expense. The design, daringly simple when fashion favored elaborate decoration, would ensure Marianne stood apart from the flock of white muslin debutantes. As the days dissolved in a whirlwind of fittings, Marianne found herself experiencing an unusual flutter of anticipation. Perhaps it was merely the event's significance, or perhaps some prescient awareness whispered that her fate awaited in that Berkeley Square ballroom. Her mornings blurred together, the dancing master correcting her steps with French-accented precision. Afternoon calls, where the same conversations repeated like a musical round. Evening entertainments that served as mere preludes to the main event. In her quieter moments, when she could escape her mother's orchestrations, Marianne would stand at her window overlooking Grosvenor Square and wonder about this Lord Jonathan. What kind of man chose exile in the tropics over London's familiar pleasures? What drove someone to challenge the established order of colonial society? The fragments of information she had gathered painted a picture of someone who defied easy categorization. Neither the typical colonial administrator grown fat on rum and complacency, nor the romantic adventurer of sensational novels. Lady Jersey, encountered at Mrs. Drummond Burrell's afternoon tea, claimed to remember the boy vaguely. A serious child with penetrating gray eyes who had seemed older than his years. But 15 years could transform anyone beyond recognition, and Lady Jersey's memory, though prodigious for scandal, proved less reliable for ancient history. The Tun's fascination with Lord Jonathan reflected something deeper than mere curiosity about a potential bachelor. In an age when gentlemen followed prescribed paths, Eton, Oxford, a grand tour if Bonaparte permitted, then a life of carefully managed estates and parliamentary dabbling, here was someone who had ventured beyond the known world. The reports from Jamaica, fragmentary and often contradictory, hinted at someone who had not merely survived, but thrived in that dangerous tropical world, yet who had also challenged its fundamental assumptions. The night of the Blackwood Ball arrived wrapped in atmospheric drama. Thunder rumbled in the distance like artillery fire, and sheet lightning illuminated the London sky in brief, spectacular displays. Yet the threatened deluge held off as if even nature recognized the evening's significance. The queue of carriages stretched around Berkeley Square, each disgorging its cargo of silk-wrapped and jewel-adorned humanity into the waiting embrace of social destiny. The Blackwood mansion stood as testament to centuries of accumulated power. Unlike the bright new elegance of Grosvenor Square's recent constructions, this house wore its age like armor. The Portland stone facade, weathered to the particular gray that only London's coal smoke could produce, rose 4 stories into the electric air. Every window blazed with candlelight, turning the building into a beacon that drew society's moths to its brilliant flame. Marianne descended from the Morton carriage, her celestial blue silk seeming to capture and hold the light from the flambeau lining the entrance. The fabric, specially treated with a technique Madame Delacroix claimed was known only to 3 modistes in Europe, created an almost ethereal shimmer with each movement. She felt the weight of eyes upon her, calculating glances from matrons assessing competition for their daughters, appreciative stares from gentlemen, and the quick, sharp evaluations of her peers. The entrance hall stole her carefully maintained composure. Here was not mere wealth, but legacy made tangible. Van Dyck portraits gazed down with the assured arrogance of cavaliers who had died for their king. Ming vases, their porcelain so fine that candlelight seemed to pass through them, stood sentinel on porphyry pedestals. The ceiling, painted by some Italian master whose name was spoken in hushed, reverent tones, depicted the triumph of virtue over vice in colors that had somehow retained their vibrancy across centuries. She could smell history here, not just beeswax and wood polish, but something indefinable, as if the very walls had absorbed generations of significance. Her kid slippers whispered across marble that had been trod by princes and poets, statesmen and scoundrels. This was what the Mortons, for all their recent wealth, could never purchase. The patina of ages, the weight of accumulated consequence. The ballroom exceeded even these wonders. 3 chandeliers, each a constellation of crystal and flame, cast golden light that made every surface gleam and every jewel flash fire. The walls, covered in silk damask the color of fresh cream, provided perfect backdrop for the assembled company's peacock display. The orchestra, positioned on a raised dais decorated with hothouse flowers whose perfume competed with 100 different scents, played Mozart with the precision of automata gifted with souls. The Earl of Blackwood received his guests from an carved chair that might have graced a medieval throne room. His face, a map of 8 decades living, retained the sharp intelligence that had made him a force in the Lords since before many of his guests had been born. His eyes, still bright despite their rheumy edges, assessed each arrival with the quick judgment of long practice. Beside him stood the man who had commanded society's speculation for weeks. Lord Jonathan Blackwood exceeded even romance's most fevered imagination. He stood well above 6 feet, with the kind of broad-shouldered physique that suggested physical labor rather than genteel idleness. His hair, black as India ink, was cut in the windswept style Byron had made fashionable, though on him it seemed less affectation than natural disorder. But it was his eyes that arrested attention, gray like winter seas, holding depths that suggested experiences no drawing room could contain. His evening clothes, though perfectly cut, seemed barely to contain an energy that belonged more to wild places than ballrooms. When Marianne was presented, their eyes met with an almost physical impact. She felt the shock of it run through her entire body, as if she had touched exposed copper during a lightning storm. Lord Jonathan bowed with perfect correctness, yet his gaze lingered on her face with an intensity that should have been improper, but instead felt inevitable. When he took her gloved hand to kiss it, the heat of his touch penetrated the thin kid leather, sending sparks up her arm that settled somewhere in the vicinity of her heart. Time seemed to stretch and distort in that moment. She was aware of minute details, a small scar through his left eyebrow, the way his mouth quirked slightly as if suppressing either a smile or a secret, the faint scent of sandalwood and something else, something that spoke of sea salt and tropical storms. When he released her hand and she moved on in the receiving line, she felt oddly bereft, as if something essential had been taken from her. The ball proceeded with its ordained patterns. Lord Jonathan led out the Duke of Marlborough's insipid daughter for the opening minuet, a choice that set tongues wagging about potential alliances between 2 of England's great houses. Marianne danced with a succession of eligible gentlemen, each correct in their steps and conversation, each utterly forgettable the moment they bowed and departed. Yet her awareness remained fixed on that dark figure who moved through the ballroom with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to more dangerous territories. She noticed things others seemed to miss, the way Lord Jonathan's eyes constantly surveyed the room, noting exits and entrances with an almost military precision, the subtle tension in his shoulders when someone approached from his blind side, how he barely touched the champagne in his glass, though he held it as a prop for social interaction. These were not the habits of a gentleman who had spent peaceful years managing sugar cultivation. It was during the 3rd set, a complex country dance, that fate intervened with dramatic precision. Lord Pemberton, Marianne's elderly partner, stumbled during a particularly intricate figure. His face, already flushed from exertion and wine, went alarmingly pale. Before Marianne could steady him properly, Lord Jonathan materialized at her side as if conjured. With smooth efficiency, he transferred Lord Pemberton to the care of a hovering footman while simultaneously taking the older man's place in the set, all accomplished with such fluid grace that the dance barely paused. The orchestra, accustomed to such substitutions among their elderly patrons, continued without missing a note. The dance brought them together and apart in patterns ancient as England itself. Advance and retreat, circle and return, hands touching and releasing in a physical conversation more eloquent than words. Lord Jonathan danced with technical perfection, yet there was something in his movement that suggested he had learned these steps, not in a dancing master's studio, but through deliberate study, as one might memorize a map of enemy territory. When the figures brought them close enough for conversation, he spoke in a voice that carried traces of distant shores, not an accent precisely, but a different rhythm, as if English had become one language among many he commanded. He asked about her interests with what seemed genuine curiosity, listening to her responses with an attention that distinguished him from society gallants who viewed conversation as competitive monologue. When she confessed her love of reading, specifically her secret passion for Gothic novels that her mother considered deeply inappropriate, his eyes lit with amused interest rather than the usual polite dismissal. He mentioned Coleridge's recent work, then surprised her by quoting not the famous passages everyone knew, but an obscure line that had particularly moved her. It was as if he had somehow glimpsed her private thoughts and found them not shocking, but delightful. The dance ended too soon, abandoning them to propriety's demands. Lord Jonathan returned her to her mother's side with perfect correctness, yet his fingers pressed hers infinitesimally before release. A touch so brief it might have been imagination, yet it burned like a brand. His gray eyes held hers for a moment that contained entire conversations. Then he bowed and vanished into the crowd, leaving her oddly breathless. The supper interval provided further opportunity for observation. Lord Jonathan moved through the room with apparent ease, yet Marianne noticed how he positioned himself, always with his back to a wall, never allowing anyone to approach unseen. When Mr. Henry Ashton, a recent arrival from the West Indies, engaged him in conversation, she saw Lord Jonathan's entire demeanor shift. The social mask remained in place, but his body tensed like a drawn bow. Whatever Mr. Ashton was saying, delivered in tones too low to overhear, was not pleasant news. Through careful eavesdropping, a skill refined through years of gathering intelligence at tedious gatherings, Marianne learned fragments of Lord Jonathan's colonial story. His transformation of the Blackwood plantations had been revolutionary. Where other planters ruled through fear and force, he had instituted systems that scandalized his neighbors. There were whispers of conflicts that went beyond mere agricultural disputes, something about ships intercepted in midnight waters, about authorities both colonial and criminal who had marked him as an enemy. Lady Cowper, seated nearby in a cloud of violet scent and self-importance, declared that Lord Jonathan's fortune was substantial enough to make him the season's greatest prize. The combination of future title, established estates, and colonial wealth placed him beyond the reach of all but the highest-born ladies. Yet he seemed curiously uninterested in the parade of pristine debutantes thrust before him by ambitious mothers. Instead, Marianne noticed with a mixture of triumph and trepidation his gaze returned to her throughout the evening. Not with the obvious admiration of a smitten swain, but with something more complex, interest certainly, but also assessment, as if she presented a puzzle he was determined to solve. When their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, she felt that same electric connection, that sense of recognition that transcended mere attraction. The weeks following the Blackwood Ball unfolded like a carefully choreographed ballet where the dancers were forbidden to touch. Each movement precise, each gesture loaded with meaning, each approach countered by retreat in an endless pattern of advance and withdrawal. Society became their stage, and they, its unwitting performers, in a drama whose true nature remained hidden beneath layers of propriety and pretense. Their encounters resembled nothing so much as a game of chess played with living pieces, where every move carried consequences and the slightest miscalculation could result in checkmate of the heart. Marianne and Lord Jonathan circled each other through London's drawing rooms with the wary fascination of celestial bodies caught in mutual orbit, drawn inexorably together by forces they could neither name nor resist, yet held apart by an invisible barrier that seemed to thicken with each meeting. It was a tension not of aversion, but of an attraction that seemed too dangerous to touch, like reaching for lightning in a bottle, beautiful, illuminating, and potentially destructive. At Lady Sefton's musical evening, they discovered themselves seated in adjacent chairs as if by magnetic compulsion, the hostess's innocent smile fooling no one. At the Duchess of Devonshire's garden party, they encountered each other beside the ornamental lake, both claiming to seek solitude, yet finding instead a charged silence more eloquent than words. At Almack's, that temple of propriety where even princes could be denied entry for improper dress, Lord Jonathan claimed her for the maximum 2 dances permitted, and in those moments of sanctioned proximity, the air between them crackled with unspoken truths and suppressed desires. Each encounter deepened the inexplicable connection between them while simultaneously raising Marianne's defenses higher. Lord Jonathan possessed an unsettling ability to see through the social masks everyone wore like armor. When she attempted bright conversation about fashion or weather, he would fix her with those storm-gray eyes and ask what she truly thought about the Catholic relief bill or the Luddite troubles in the north. When she tried to maintain proper maidenly reserve, he would make some observation so astute or amusing that she forgot herself entirely, engaging in the kind of intellectual discourse that marked a woman as dangerously blue. Hyde Park, during the fashionable hour, became their unofficial battlefield. The park in May bloomed with almost violent beauty, hawthorn blossoms releasing their sweet, slightly decaying scent, roses climbing the walls of nearby mansions in riots of pink and crimson. Lord Jonathan rode a black stallion that seemed barely civilized, its eyes rolling white when other riders approached too close. Marianne's neat bay mare, purchased by her father from Tattersall's with careful attention to both bloodline and temperament, seemed diminutive beside the great beast, yet the 2 horses developed an odd friendship, nickering greetings when they met. Their encounters along Rotten Row appeared accidental, yet happened with such regularity that society began to take notice. The betting book at White's, that sacred repository of masculine wagering, reportedly contained several entries speculating on when Lord Jonathan would make his declaration. The ladies were equally fascinated, though their speculation took the form of whispered conferences behind fans and significant glances when the pair appeared together. It was during one particularly golden morning, when dew still sparkled on spider webs like nature's diamonds, that Lord Jonathan revealed more of his true nature than perhaps he intended. They had paused beneath ancient oaks whose branches created a green cathedral overhead, their horses content to crop the sweet spring grass. The relative privacy, only a few other riders visible in the distance, created an intimacy impossible in drawing rooms. A commotion erupted from a nearby path. A child's terrified screams pierced the morning calm as a pony, startled by a dog bursting from the undergrowth, bolted with its young rider clinging desperately to its mane. The nursemaid ran behind, her cries only adding to the chaos. Lord Jonathan's transformation was instantaneous. The social gentleman vanished, replaced by someone forged in crisis. Without hesitation, he spurred his stallion forward, calculating angles and speed with military precision. He intercepted the runaway pony at full gallop, leaning from his saddle to pluck the child free with one arm while controlling both animals with an expertise that spoke of long practice in far more dangerous situations. When he deposited the sobbing child safely into his nursemaid's arms, his gentleness formed a striking contrast to the controlled violence of the rescue. He knelt in the grass, heedless of his pristine buckskins, speaking to the boy in low, soothing tones until terror transformed into worship. The child, perhaps 6 years old, gazed at his rescuer as if Lord Jonathan were one of the knights from his nursery tales come to life. Marianne observed this scene with growing understanding. The man before her was no mere colonial administrator grown wealthy on sugar and rum. His reflexes, his horsemanship, the way he had assessed and acted upon the crisis, these spoke of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. When he returned to her side, she could not help but comment on his remarkable skill. His response was characteristically evasive, wrapped in self-deprecating humor that did not quite reach his eyes. Yet she pressed, driven by curiosity stronger than propriety. Finally, perhaps recognizing her genuine interest rather than mere social flirtation, he admitted to certain experiences in Jamaica that had required skills beyond ledger-keeping and crop rotation. Pirates still plagued Caribbean waters despite the Navy's best efforts. Certain traders dealt in cargo that violated both law and morality. A man who stood against such forces needed abilities not taught at Oxford. The admission, fragmentary as it was, illuminated much. Those watchful eyes, that constant awareness of surroundings, the controlled readiness for violence. Lord Jonathan was a warrior masquerading as a gentleman, and not entirely successfully. Their relationship, for what else could one call this intense, complicated dance, became the season's primary entertainment. Lady Morton existed in a state of barely suppressed elation. Lord Jonathan Blackwood represented a prize beyond her wildest matchmaking dreams. She orchestrated dinner parties with military precision, ensuring Lord Jonathan's attendance through careful manipulation of guest lists. She cultivated Lady Pemberton with the dedication of a botanist tending rare orchids. She even attempted with limited success to discover Lord Jonathan's preferences in everything from music to cuisine, the better to display Marianne's accomplishments. Sir Edmund Morton, more cautious by nature and profession, conducted his own investigations. His network of commercial contacts extended throughout the empire, and he used them to gather intelligence about Lord Jonathan's colonial activities. The responses he received proved both reassuring and disturbing. The man's financial credentials were impeccable. His management of the Blackwood plantations had tripled their value through innovative practices. His social standing was unassailable. The future Earl of Blackwood could hardly be more eligible. Yet there were shadows in his history, periods where the record grew vague. Several correspondents hinted at conflicts with authorities, both colonial and criminal. One letter, from a factor in Kingston, mentioned that certain powerful men would pay handsomely to know Lord Jonathan's location. Another, from a ship's captain who traded between London and the Caribbean, warned that Lord Jonathan had made enemies who possessed both long memories and longer reaches. It was at Mrs. Drummond Burrell's card party that matters took a decidedly darker turn. Marianne, partnered with Lord Jonathan for whist against Lord and Lady Castlereagh, found herself engaged in a battle that transcended mere cards. Every play became weighted with meaning, every glance across the green baize carrying unspoken messages. Their opponents might have been furniture for all the attention either paid them. Between rubbers, Lady Castlereagh drew Marianne aside, ostensibly to admire her pearl combs, but actually to deliver a warning wrapped in concern. There were, she suggested, aspects of Lord Jonathan's past that bore investigation. Certain individuals had arrived recently from Jamaica, men whose business was unclear, but whose interest in Lord Jonathan was obvious. A young lady of good reputation would be wise to exercise caution. When Marianne returned to the card table, she found Lord Jonathan in intense conversation with Mr. Henry Ashton. The gentleman's appearance had changed. His tropical tan had faded, but something predatory had emerged in his expression. Whatever he was saying, delivered in tones too low for general hearing, had transformed Lord Jonathan's demeanor entirely. The social mask remained, but underneath Marianne glimpsed something dangerous, like seeing a shark's fin break the surface of calm water. The rest of the evening passed in strange tension. Lord Jonathan remained at Marianne's side, but his attention divided constantly between her and surveillance of the room. She noticed how he maneuvered to keep her away from certain individuals, how his hand occasionally moved toward his coat as if reaching for something that was not there, the gesture of a man accustomed to being armed. When the party concluded and he handed her into the Morton carriage, his fingers gripped hers with unusual force. He seemed about to speak, to warn or confess something vital. Instead, he merely raised her hand to his lips, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that seemed to convey everything he could not say. Then he stepped back into the shadows, and she had the strangest feeling he would not be returning directly home. Lady Pemberton's breakfast the following morning provided partial illumination. The Earl's sister had developed a genuine fondness for Marianne that transcended social maneuvering. Over chocolate and delicate pastries that neither woman more than tasted, she spoke of her nephew with unusual frankness. The story she told was remarkable for what it revealed and what it concealed. Lord Jonathan had indeed been sent to Jamaica at 15, but the circumstances were more complex than simple family disagreement. There had been, Lady Pemberton admitted with delicate hesitation, questions about irregularities surrounding his birth. Not about legitimacy, she hastened to add, but about certain events that had occurred around the time of his arrival. Papers had gone missing. Witnesses had disappeared. The boy himself had been discovered with injuries suggesting violence, though he had never explained their origin. His guardian in Jamaica, a distant cousin, had died under mysterious circumstances when Jonathan was barely 20. Some said fever, others suggested poison, still others whispered about a duel fought at dawn on a deserted beach. Jonathan had assumed control of the plantations with an authority that suggested prior preparation, as if he had been training for the role rather than thrust into it. His methods had scandalized colonial society. Where other planters maintained order through brutality, he had instituted systems based on efficiency and, shocking to his neighbors, a degree of humanity. He had refused to separate families, had provided medical care, had even established a system where slaves could earn their freedom through years of service. The other planters had viewed him as a traitor to his class, a dangerous radical whose ideas might spread like contagion. But there was more, Lady Pemberton hinted, her voice dropping despite the privacy of her morning room. Jonathan had involved himself in matters beyond agriculture. Ships had been intercepted carrying illegal cargo. Certain traders had found their operations disrupted by anonymous information reaching authorities. There were stories of midnight raids on hidden coves, of confrontations with men who traded in human misery despite abolition. When Marianne gently probed about Lord Jonathan's parents, Lady Pemberton's expression shuddered like windows before a storm. That, she said firmly, was not her story to tell. But she added, fixing Marianne with eyes surprisingly sharp for her age, that Jonathan was the finest man she knew, worth 10 of the titled wastrels who populated London's ballrooms. If certain mysteries surrounded him, they only added to, rather than detracted from his worth. Act 4. The moment of connection. The zenith of their complicated courtship arrived at the midsummer celebration at Vauxhall Gardens. June had brought unseasonable warmth to London, and the pleasure gardens offered respite from the city's accumulated heat and odors. The gardens at night transformed into something from fairy tales, thousands of colored lanterns creating pools of jeweled light among the dark walks, music floating through the perfumed air, the sound of water features providing counterpoint to distant laughter. The Morton party had secured a supper box with an excellent view of the fireworks, that ultimate spectacle that drew all of London regardless of rank. Lord Jonathan had been invited to join them, along with carefully selected others who might either advance Marianne's consequence or provide appropriate camouflage for what was increasingly obvious courtship. Marianne dressed with particular care that evening, choosing a gown of silver-green silk that seemed to capture and reflect the garden's fairy lights. The fabric, so fine it seemed to float rather than hang, had been a gift from her father after a particularly successful trading venture. Her mother had initially protested its daring color. Unmarried ladies wore white or pastels, but even she admitted the effect was stunning rather than scandalous. The journey to Vauxhall by water added to the evening's enchantment. The Thames at sunset turned to molten gold, and the wherries carrying society to pleasure seemed like vessels from ancient myths. Lord Jonathan had arrived early, and Marianne found him waiting at the water stairs, his dark evening clothes making him seem like a shadow given substance. When he handed her from the boat, their fingers entwined for a moment longer than necessary, and she felt that familiar electric connection that had marked their every encounter. The gardens were crowded with all of London society, from duchesses to merchants' daughters, all mingling with a freedom impossible in more formal settings. The ordinary rules relaxed here. Strict chaperoning became general supervision, formal address gave way to lighter conversation, and the dark walks provided privacy for those brave enough to risk reputation for stolen moments. Their party promenaded along the principal walks, seeing and being seen in the traditional fashion. Lord Jonathan remained close by Marianne's side, his presence creating an invisible barrier that discouraged other gentlemen from approaching. Their conversation flowed with the ease of long acquaintance, yet underneath ran that constant current of awareness, that sense of standing on a precipice waiting for courage or circumstance to provide the final push. It was during the orchestral performance, as the musicians played a particularly moving piece by Handel that seemed to pull emotion from the very air, that Lord Jonathan suggested a walk to view the famous cascade. The water feature, illuminated by colored lights, created a spectacle that drew visitors to a relatively secluded area of the gardens. Lady Morton, deep in gossip with Mrs. Burbridge about some scandal involving a duke's daughter and a dancing master, merely waved them away with an admonition to return for the fireworks. The path to the cascade wound through groves where lanterns hung like fallen stars, their light filtered through leaves into patterns of gold and shadow. Other couples strolled in the same direction, providing the fiction of propriety, yet each pair existed in their own world, carefully not seeing others who wished not to be seen. The cascade itself justified its fame, a marvel of engineering that sent water tumbling over artificial rocks with such force that mist rose like smoke, catching the colored lights in rainbow spirals. The sound created a curtain of privacy, hiding conversations from any who might pass nearby. Lord Jonathan found them a position partially screened by ornamental shrubbery, where they could observe the spectacle while remaining half hidden in shadow. Standing there, with the cascade's roar filling the air and light dancing through the mist, something shifted between them. The careful social barriers they had maintained, already weakened by weeks of encounter, finally crumbled entirely. Lord Jonathan stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the mixture of sandalwood and something uniquely him that made her pulse race. When he spoke, his voice had dropped its social veneer entirely. He told her truths he had shared with no one else in England, not just about managing plantations, but about his secret war against those who continued to trade in human cargo despite abolition. He spoke of midnight interceptions, of battles fought in hidden coves, of a network of allies and enemies that stretched across the Caribbean. He told her of the loneliness of his position, always watchful, never fully trusting, belonging neither to the colonial society he disrupted nor the English world he had left as a boy. His return to England had been meant as escape, a chance to claim his birthright and live without constant vigilance. Instead, he had found society's constraints even more suffocating than physical danger, until her. The word hung between them like a bridge across an abyss. In Marianne, he had found not just beauty, though he acknowledged that with a look that made heat rise in her cheeks, but recognition. Someone who, like him, existed partially outside society's comfortable boundaries. Someone whose intelligence and spirit had been shaped rather than broken by restriction. Someone who might understand a man who had been forged in tropical crucibles rather than English drawing rooms. The moment stretched between them, taut as a drawn bow. Lord Jonathan raised his hand to her face, his fingers barely grazing her cheek in a touch so light it might have been imagination. Yet it burned through her entire being. She should have stepped away, should have remembered the 100 rules that governed proper behavior. Instead, she found herself swaying toward him, drawn by a force that transcended propriety. For one heart-stopping moment, it seemed he would kiss her there in the garden. Scandal be damned. She could see the struggle in his eyes, desire warring with honor, need fighting protective instinct. His hand curved around her cheek, thumb brushing across her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. The explosion of the first firework shattered the spell like glass. They sprang apart as cascades of golden light filled the sky, and the gardens erupted in gasps and applause. Yet something fundamental had changed. As they walked back to the supper box, maintaining proper distance that felt like miles, both knew they had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. The following days brought a new intensity to their interactions. At every gathering, their awareness of each other created a separate sphere that excluded the rest of the world. When Lord Jonathan called at Morton House during proper hours, his conversations with Sir Edmund about trade and politics served as mere pretext. The real communication happened in glances, in the brush of fingers when he turned the pages of her music, in the way their breathing synchronized when they stood near each other. It was during one such afternoon, while Marianne played a Mozart sonata with fingers that trembled slightly under his regard, that Lord Jonathan made a confession that chilled her blood. He had received communications from Jamaica, warnings that his enemies there had not forgotten or forgiven his interference. Men were coming, or perhaps had already arrived, who would be pleased to see him suffer for destroying their profitable enterprises. The music faltered as she absorbed this information. When she turned to face him, she saw beneath his careful control a very real concern. Not for himself, she realized with sudden clarity, but for anyone close to him who might become a target. His enemies were not gentlemen who would limit their revenge to him alone. They were men who understood that the greatest pain came from harming those one sought to protect. She tried to address this directly, to tell him she would rather face danger at his side than safety alone. But he deflected with forced lightness, turning the conversation to safer ground. Yet she had seen the truth in his eyes. He was a man surrounded by shadows, and those shadows threatened to engulf anyone who came too close. The very attraction between them had become a danger, and she could see him beginning to withdraw, to rebuild the walls she had worked so hard to breach. The crisis that nearly destroyed everything arrived in the form of Mrs. Celeste Warren at Lady Melbourne's soirée. She entered the room like a tropical storm making landfall, sudden, dramatic, and potentially devastating. Everything about her spoke of foreign shores and forbidden knowledge. Where English ladies prized pallor, her skin held the golden warmth of tropical sun. Where fashion dictated delicate pastels, she wore deep crimson that should have been scandalous, but instead seemed inevitable. Her dark hair, dressed in an elaborate style that incorporated what appeared to be actual gold threads, framed a face of such sensual beauty that men forgot their conversations mid-sentence. More significantly, she appeared to know Lord Jonathan with an intimacy that set every tongue in London wagging within minutes of her arrival. She approached him with the confidence of established claim, laying her hand on his arm with proprietary ease, laughing at references no one else understood. Her voice, accented with musical Caribbean inflections, carried across the room as she spoke of shared memories, moonlit nights at plantation houses, dangerous expeditions into Jamaica's interior, encounters with those dreadful pirates that she made sound thrilling rather than threatening. Lord Jonathan's response defied easy interpretation. He neither welcomed nor rebuffed her familiarity, maintaining a courtesy that could have meant anything. Yet Marianne noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes tracked Mrs. Warren's movements, even when appearing to attend to other conversations. When the woman laughed, a sound like silver bells with slightly tarnished edges, his fingers tightened on whatever he happened to be holding. Through the efficiently cruel network of society gossip, Marianne soon learned Mrs. Warren's supposed history. Her late husband had owned the plantation neighboring the Blackwood holdings. The beautiful young bride and the handsome administrator had been thrown together by proximity and isolation. Some whispered of torrid tropical nights, others of a deeper connection, thwarted only by Mr. Warren's inconvenient existence. His death from fever 2 years prior had freed her to follow Lord Jonathan to England. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling. Lady Cowper claimed to have heard from her cousin in Kingston that Lord Jonathan and Mrs. Warren had been discovered in a compromising position at the governor's ball. Mrs. Drummond Burrell insisted her sources spoke of secret meetings in hidden grottos, of passion too intense for civilization's constraints. Even Lady Jersey, usually skeptical of unfounded gossip, admitted the evidence seemed compelling. Lord Jonathan made no attempt to explain or deny these rumors, which cut Marianne more deeply than any confirmation could have. When they met at social gatherings, he maintained perfect politeness that felt worse than coldness. He danced with her when obligation demanded, conversed when proximity required, but the electric connection between them had been replaced by careful distance. Meanwhile, Mrs. Warren appeared at every event he attended, her tinkling laugh and knowing smiles a constant reminder of shared tropical history. The situation reached its nadir at the Regent's Carlton House reception, an invitation that should have marked Marianne's greatest social triumph. The Prince Regent himself, grown fat and dissolute but still commanding when he chose, had noticed her during the presentations and declared her a diamond of the first water. She wore cream silk embroidered with seed pearls that had cost her father nearly £1,000, her hair dressed with combs that had belonged to her grandmother, one of the few heirlooms the Mortons possessed. Yet triumph turned to ashes as she watched Mrs. Warren monopolize Lord Jonathan throughout the evening. The woman whispered in his ear with shocking intimacy, her hand resting on his arm as if it belonged there. When others approached, she spoke of "dear Jonathan" with casual possession, relating anecdotes that painted a picture of profound connection. Lord Jonathan stood rigid beside her, neither confirming nor denying, trapped by the very politeness that governed society. When he finally approached Marianne for the dance, propriety demanded. Her pride had crystallized into Arctic ice. She accepted his hand with formal courtesy that would have frozen flame. They moved through the quadrille in silence, the easy conversation of previous encounters replaced by a void that seemed to grow with every step. She could feel his eyes on her face, sense his frustration at her coldness, but she kept her gaze fixed on a point past his shoulder. Finally, between the movements of the dance, his control cracked. His voice, usually so carefully modulated, carried an edge of genuine anger as he demanded to know what he had done to earn such treatment. The question, delivered with what seemed like genuine bewilderment, shattered Marianne's composure entirely. That he could stand there after parading his tropical paramour before all of society and ask what he had done wrong, it was beyond bearing. When the dance concluded, she curtsied with mechanical perfection and walked away without a word, leaving him alone on the dance floor. She did not look back to see his expression, though Lady Cowper later reported he had stood there for a full minute, staring after her with a face like granite. Sir Edmund Morton chose this precise moment to inform his family that Mr. George Thornbury had requested permission to pay his addresses. The heir to a respectable fortune and nephew to the Earl of Westbrook, Mr. Thornbury represented solid worth rather than dangerous attraction. He was everything a prudent father could wish: stable, devoted, unlikely to involve his wife in Caribbean adventures or mysterious vendettas. His admiration for Marianne was genuine and uncomplicated, his character unblemished by scandal or secrets. Lady Morton, despite her dreams of greater glory, recognized the practical value of the match. Lord Jonathan seemed increasingly entangled with that Warren creature, and Marianne's reputation could not survive being publicly rejected for a worldly widow. She pressed her daughter to accept Mr. Thornbury's suit with arguments that mixed maternal concern with social strategy. Marianne, her heart in rebellion, but her pride wounded beyond bearing, allowed Mr. Thornbury to court her. He brought flowers every morning, conventional roses rather than the exotic orchids Lord Jonathan had once sent. He took her driving in Hyde Park at unfashionable hours to avoid crowds. He conversed about safe topics: his estate in Sussex, his collection of first editions, his plans for agricultural improvement that involved no midnight raids or moral crusades. If his presence failed to make her pulse race, if his careful compliments felt like dust compared to Lord Jonathan's intense regard, these seemed like small sacrifices for peace of mind. Mr. Thornbury would never bring danger to her doorstep, would never have mysterious enemies or complicated pasts. He was, everyone agreed, exactly what a sensible young woman should want. The Ton watched this development with the avidity of spectators at a particularly engaging theatrical. Bets were placed at White's about whether Lord Jonathan would intervene. Would pride or passion prove stronger? Would the mysterious Mrs. Warren maintain her hold, or would the English rose triumph over the tropical orchid? Lord Jonathan himself seemed caught between fury and anguish. He appeared at every event Marianne attended, his gray eyes following her with an intensity that should have burned through her careful indifference. Yet he made no move to explain or reconcile, his own pride perhaps matching hers. Mrs. Warren remained constantly at his side, her possessive presence a barrier more effective than any wall. At one particularly painful evening at Almack's, Marianne danced with Mr. Thornbury, while Lord Jonathan partnered Mrs. Warren mere feet away. The contrast was stark. Thornbury's respectful distance versus the way Mrs. Warren pressed close to Lord Jonathan. Thornbury's proper conversation versus Mrs. Warren's intimate whispers. Yet when Marianne caught Lord Jonathan's eyes over Thornbury's shoulder, she saw something that looked like desperation, quickly masked but unmistakable. The truth, when it emerged, came from the most unexpected source. Mr. Henry Ashton called upon Sir Edmund Morton on a wet Thursday morning when the rest of society was sleeping off the previous night's excesses. He arrived without fanfare, his card simply stating, "Urgent business regarding Miss Morton's safety and happiness." In the privacy of Sir Edmund's study, surrounded by ledgers and the smell of tobacco, Mr. Ashton revealed a tale that strained credulity, yet carried the unmistakable ring of truth. He began by establishing his credentials, not merely a traitor, but an agent of the Crown, sent to investigate certain illegal activities in the Caribbean that threatened British interests. Mrs. Celeste Warren, he revealed, was not what she seemed. Far from being a widow, she was the wife of Marcus Warren, one of the most dangerous men in the Caribbean. Warren operated a network that smuggled not just goods, but human cargo, exploiting loopholes and corrupting officials to continue the slave trade despite its abolition. Lord Jonathan's systematic destruction of this network had cost Warren millions and earned his undying enmity. The woman calling herself Mrs. Warren had come to London with specific instructions: destroy Lord Jonathan, as he had destroyed her husband's empire. Her weapons were not pistol or poison, but reputation and innuendo. By creating the appearance of an intimate connection, she aimed to ruin his prospects in society, to isolate him from any chance of happiness or belonging. It was, Ashton admitted, a brilliantly cruel strategy. More chillingly, Warren himself had not remained idle in Jamaica. He had sent other agents to London, men who watched Lord Jonathan's every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. 3 had already been apprehended attempting to break into Blackwood House. Another had been caught following Lord Jonathan's carriage with weapons. The danger was very real and very present. Most significantly, Mr. Ashton explained Lord Jonathan's behavior toward Marianne. The man had recognized the growing threat early. Mrs. Warren's arrival had coincided with intelligence about the assassination plot. Every moment of coldness, every public appearance with Mrs. Warren had been calculated to convince the watchers that Miss Morton meant nothing to him. It was the only way to keep her safe from becoming a weapon against him or a target herself. Sir Edmund, his pragmatic mind rapidly processing this information, asked why Lord Jonathan had not simply exposed Mrs. Warren's deception. Mr. Ashton's answer was sobering. To do so would trigger immediate retaliation not just against Lord Jonathan, but against anyone he had shown affection toward. Warren's network had made it clear: cooperate with his wife's charade or watch innocents suffer. Lord Jonathan had chosen to sacrifice his own happiness rather than risk Marianne's safety. Marianne, summoned to hear this revelation, felt her carefully constructed walls of pride and hurt crumble to dust. Every slight, every moment with Mrs. Warren had been an act of protection. Lord Jonathan had chosen her safety over his own happiness, had allowed her to think the worst of him rather than expose her to danger. The depth of such sacrifice took her breath away. She had read of courtly love, of knights who served their ladies from afar, but this was something deeper, a love that manifested not in grand gestures, but in silent suffering, not in passionate pursuit, but in deliberate withdrawal. He had watched her turn to another man, had endured society's whispers about his supposed affair, had sacrificed his reputation and his heart to keep her safe. Yet knowledge brought its own dangers. If Warren's agents learned that she knew the truth, that she still mattered to Lord Jonathan despite his performance, she would become the perfect weapon against him. Mr. Ashton advised the Mortons to continue as if nothing had changed, to allow Marianne's engagement to Mr. Thornbury to proceed, thereby convincing all observers that Lord Jonathan's stratagem had succeeded. Marianne found herself trapped in an impossible position. To save the man she now knew loved her required her to marry another. To break her engagement and reveal her true feelings would not only endanger herself, but would render meaningless everything Lord Jonathan had sacrificed. The solution came from an unexpected quarter. Lord Blackwood, the elderly earl whose health had been failing, proved more astute than anyone had credited. Through his network of connections, spanning decades of political intrigue, he had been conducting his own investigation. The results were illuminating. More importantly, the Earl had connections reaching to the highest levels of government. A few carefully worded conversations, some documents retrieved from dusty files, and suddenly Mrs. Warren found herself the subject of official scrutiny. Her husband's activities, it seemed, had violated not just moral law, but several treaties to which Britain was signatory. Moreover, there was the small matter of forged documents regarding her supposed widowhood. Fraud was still a hanging offense. The Earl also revealed something that changed everything. Lord Jonathan had been working with the Crown all along. His actions in Jamaica had been sanctioned. His enemies were enemies of the state, and Mrs. Warren's presence in London constituted foreign interference in British affairs. The Home Office had been building a case, waiting for the right moment to act. The climax came at what should have been Marianne's engagement ball. The Mortons had spared no expense, transforming their Grosvenor Square mansion into a fairyland of flowers and light. White roses and orange blossoms, symbols of marriage, decorated every surface. The best musicians had been engaged, the supper ordered from Gunter's, and invitation acceptance had been universal. Even the Prince Regent had promised to make an appearance. Marianne, dressed in white silk that proclaimed her soon-to-be married status, stood beside Mr. Thornbury, receiving congratulations with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. He was everything admirable. Handsome in his evening clothes, attentive to her comfort, gracious to their guests. If she felt like she was dying inside, she hid it with the skill learned through a London season. Lord Jonathan attended as protocol demanded, his face a mask of polite indifference that fooled no one who truly looked. He had partnered Mrs. Warren, whose triumphant smiles suggested she believed her victory complete. The woman wore scarlet, a shocking choice for another woman's engagement ball, and diamonds that caught the light like tears. It was as the dancing began, just as Lord Jonathan led Mrs. Warren onto the floor for the opening minuet, that the Earl of Blackwood arrived. Despite his age and recent illness, he entered with the authority of a man who had shaped nations. Behind him came something unexpected. Officers of the Crown in full uniform, their presence causing a ripple of shocked whispers through the ballroom. The arrest of Mrs. Warren was accomplished with British efficiency. One moment she was dancing, the next she was being escorted from the room by polite but implacable officials. The charges, read quietly but clearly, included conspiracy, extortion, fraud, and activities prejudicial to Crown interests. Her protests, delivered in suddenly accented English that revealed her origins, fell on deaf ears. As she was led away, she cast one look of pure venom at Lord Jonathan, then at Marianne. In that moment, her mask slipped entirely, revealing the calculating criminal beneath the seductive facade. Her final words, hissed like a curse, warned that Marcus Warren had a long reach and longer memory. The departure of Mrs. Warren created a sensation that rippled through the ballroom like waves from a dropped stone. Lord Jonathan stood in the center of the dance floor, suddenly alone, his carefully maintained mask finally slipping to reveal the exhaustion of weeks of deception and sacrifice. Mr. Thornbury, proving himself a gentleman of exceptional quality, approached Marianne where she stood frozen beside her parents. With quiet dignity that earned him respect that would last his lifetime, he released her from their engagement. He had seen, he said, what everyone with eyes must see. Her heart belonged elsewhere, and he would not hold her to a promise made under false circumstances. His bow was perfect, his smile genuine if sad, and he departed with a grace that made several young ladies reassess his worth. What followed was a scene that would be recounted at dinner parties for decades. Lord Jonathan crossed the floor with deliberate steps, his gray eyes fixed on Marianne's face. The crowd parted before him, everyone sensing the moment's significance. The orchestra had stopped playing, and in the silence, his footsteps seemed to echo like heartbeats. When he reached her, he did not immediately speak. Instead, he extended his hand in silent invitation. Marianne, her heart pounding so forcefully she thought it might escape her chest, placed her fingers in his. The orchestra, with impeccable timing or perhaps divine intervention, began a waltz, that still scandalous dance that allowed partners to hold each other with shocking intimacy. As they moved together across the floor, Lord Jonathan finally spoke, his voice low and urgent, meant for her ears alone. He told her of the agony of maintaining distance when every fiber of his being yearned toward her, of watching her with another man while knowing he had driven her there, of choosing her safety over his happiness and finding that without her, no happiness was possible. He spoke of the specific moments that had nearly broken his resolve, seeing her in another man's arms at Almack's, watching Thornberry bring her flowers, knowing that his own actions had pushed her toward a safe but passionless future. He had come close to abandoning his plan a dozen times, only to receive new intelligence about threats against her that reinforced the necessity of his sacrifice. Marianne, freed at last to speak her heart, told him of her own suffering, of believing herself forgotten for another, of the greater pain of learning the truth and being unable to act upon it, of discovering that love could be not just passion and romance, but sacrifice and protection, that the greatest love might manifest as letting go rather than holding tight. Around them, the ballroom had become a universe of two. Other dancers had stopped to watch, but neither noticed. They were lost in each other, in the relief of truth after so much deception, in the joy of connection after forced separation. When the music ended, Lord Jonathan did something that shocked society and delighted romantics for generations. There, in the middle of the Morton ballroom, before the assembled cream of the ton, he dropped to one knee. The collective gasp could have been heard in Cheapside. His proposal was everything and nothing like tradition demanded. He did not promise her ease or safety. Indeed, he warned that Marcus Warren remained at large, that his enemies might always shadow their steps. But he promised that every danger would be faced together, that every adventure would be shared, that he would spend his life earning the happiness he had nearly sacrificed for her safety. He spoke of specific dreams, of returning to Jamaica not as administrator but as reformer, of using their combined fortunes to establish schools and hospitals, of fighting the good fight against those who traded in human misery. He painted a picture of a life lived with purpose, with passion, with the kind of love that had already survived separation and deception and would therefore survive anything. Marianne's acceptance, clear and unhesitating, brought tears to even the most cynical eyes. Lady Jersey was seen to dab at her cheeks with a lace handkerchief, while the formidable Lady Castlereagh smiled with genuine warmth. Even the Prince Regent, who had arrived in time to witness the proposal, declared it the most romantic thing he had seen since his own youth. The wedding, held 6 weeks later at St. George's, Hanover Square, was the event of the season. The church overflowed with the highest ranks of society, all eager to witness the union that had captivated London. The story of Lord Jonathan's sacrifice and Mrs. Warren's deception had spread through the ton like wildfire, transforming him from mysterious colonial to romantic hero. Marianne, radiant in cream silk and ancestral Blackwood diamonds, a gift from the Earl who had embraced her as the daughter he never had, walked down the aisle on her father's arm with the confidence of a woman who had found not just love, but partnership. The dress, created by Madame Delacroix as a labor of love, featured tiny pearls sewn to catch the light with every movement, making her seem to glow from within. Lord Jonathan waited at the altar, his austere handsomeness softened by an expression of such profound joy that several young ladies sighed audibly. Beside him stood not the fashionable groomsman one might expect, but Mr. Henry Ashton and several other men whose weathered faces suggested histories as complex as the groom's own. These were his true brothers, forged in dangerous waters rather than playing fields of Eton. The ceremony proceeded with traditional dignity until the moment when the officiant asked if anyone knew of any impediment to the marriage. The church doors burst open with theatrical timing that would have seemed contrived in a novel, but was terrifyingly real in life. A man strode in. A man whose face was Lord Jonathan's exact duplicate, down to the gray eyes and the small scar through the left eyebrow. The gasps that ran through the congregation threatened to lift the ancient roof. The stranger, dressed in travel-stained clothing that had once been elegant, advanced down the aisle with grim determination. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of truth and the bitterness of betrayal. He claimed to be the true Lord Jonathan Blackwood, kept prisoner in Jamaica for the past 2 years, while an impostor took his place, claimed his inheritance, and now attempted to steal his bride. The man at the altar, he declared with damning conviction, was his twin brother, a brother whose existence had been hidden from society, who had been raised in secret shame, who had conspired to steal a birthright that was never his. The church erupted in chaos. Ladies fainted with theatrical precision, gentlemen demanded satisfaction for the insult to their intelligence, and poor Marianne stood frozen at the altar, looking between the two identical faces with growing horror. Could everything have been an even greater deception? Had she fallen in love with an impostor? The man she had been about to marry, the man she thought was Lord Jonathan, stood perfectly still, the joy draining from his face like water from a broken vessel. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of resignation that suggested this moment had been long expected, even if its timing was catastrophic. Yet what he said next transformed everything once again. Yes, he confirmed, they were twins. But the truth was more complex than simple imposture. They had been separated at birth due to a family scandal. Their mother's affair had led their father to doubt the legitimacy of one son. The child he suspected of being baseborn had been sent away in secret, raised abroad with a false name, while the acknowledged heir remained in England. The speaker at the altar, the man Marianne knew as Lord Jonathan, was indeed that exiled brother. He had been called James Blackwood in his youth, before being sent to Jamaica under the guardianship of a distant cousin. Everything he had told Marianne about his life there was true. The plantation management, the fight against slave traders, the dangers and adventures. What he had not revealed was that 2 years ago, he had discovered his twin's existence when the true Jonathan had arrived in Jamaica, seeking to claim colonial properties he had never known existed. The meeting between the brothers had been explosive. Jonathan, the legitimate heir, had proved to be everything James was not: dissolute, cruel, involved with the very slave traders James had been fighting. The truth about the imprisonment was even more damning. The true Jonathan had not been imprisoned, but had been living in debauched luxury, funded by his involvement in the illegal trade. He had been Marcus Warren's partner, not his enemy. Every action James had taken against the slave trade had been interpreted by Jonathan as an attack on his own interests. He had come to London not to reclaim his rightful place, but to destroy the brother who had exposed his crimes. Mr. Ashton stepped forward with a leather portfolio containing documents that painted the complete picture. Letters in Jonathan's own hand discussing cargo in terms that made their meaning clear. Banking records showing payments from Warren's operations. Testimonies from Jamaica describing the true Jonathan's cruelties, his participation in raids not to free slaves, but to steal them from other traders. The Earl of Blackwood, that astute old gentleman, rose from his position in the front pew with surprising vigor. His voice, carrying the authority of decades of power, cut through the chaos. He had known, he revealed, of both brothers' existence all along. The shame of admitting to the family scandal had kept him silent, but he had watched from afar as one brother brought honor to the Blackwood name while the other dragged it through colonial mud. More shocking still, he had arranged for James to be sent to Jamaica specifically to monitor Jonathan's activities. The reports he had received over the years had confirmed his worst fears about his legitimate nephew's character while filling him with pride for the supposedly baseborn one. Blood, he declared, mattered less than honor. The Earl's declaration was decisive. He formally disinherited the legitimate Jonathan for crimes that brought shame upon the family name, and legally adopted James as his heir. The documents had been drawn up weeks ago, pending only this moment of truth. The man at the altar was indeed Lord Jonathan Blackwood, not by birth perhaps, but by choice, by worth, and now by law. The exposed twin, faced with the complete collapse of his scheme and the threat of prosecution for his crimes, attempted to flee. He was prevented by Mr. Ashton's associates, those watchful men whose presence now made perfect sense. As he was led away, he cast one look of pure venom at his brother, a look that promised this was not over. But the authorities were ready for him, and his transportation to face trial in Jamaica would occur under heavy guard. For Marianne, standing at the altar in her wedding finery, only one thing mattered. The man before her, whether born James or Jonathan, was the same man who had sacrificed his happiness for her safety, who had fought against evil in Caribbean waters, who had won her heart with his complexity and depth. His parentage mattered less than his character. When the officiant, after some confusion and consultation with legal authorities present, asked if she still wished to proceed with the marriage, her answer rang clear through the church. She would marry this man, whatever his name, whatever his past, because she knew his heart. The fact that he had overcome the circumstances of his birth to become a man of honor only increased her admiration. The ceremony concluded with less traditional dignity but more genuine emotion than any society wedding in memory. When Lord Jonathan, for that was how he would always be known, kissed his bride, the spontaneous applause that erupted spoke of romance, triumphant over deception, of love conquering all obstacles, of truth ultimately prevailing over lies. The wedding breakfast at Blackwood House became legendary not for its elegance, though the arrangements were impeccable, but for the extraordinary story that continued to unfold throughout the afternoon. Guests learned of the twins' tragic separation, of one brother's descent into darkness while the other fought for light, of the complex web of deception that had nearly destroyed multiple lives. Lady Jersey, holding court near the champagne fountain, declared it better than any novel she had ever read. The romantic story of the wronged brother who had made himself worthy of the name denied him by birth, who had won love through sacrifice rather than inheritance, who had faced down both physical and moral dangers. It was, she proclaimed, the very stuff of legend. The newly married couple departed for their honeymoon amid a shower of rose petals and good wishes. They would travel to Italy, the Earl's wedding gift, including a villa on Lake Como, where they could find peace after the tumultuous events of their courtship. As their carriage rolled away from Berkeley Square, Marianne rested her head on her husband's shoulder, finally able to show affection without fear or constraint. The scandal of the switched brothers would fuel gossip for months to come. The true Jonathan's trial and subsequent transportation to Australia for his crimes became a cautionary tale about the corruption of privilege without principle. James's story, of the cast-off son who had made himself worthy through determination and courage, became an inspiration to those who believed character mattered more than birthright. But for Marianne and her Jonathan, the future held promise beyond society's gossip. They would return from Italy to find London ready to embrace them fully. The scandal transformed into romantic legend. The Earl, his health improved by the joy of seeing his nephew happily settled, would live another 3 years, long enough to hold his first great-nephew, named Edmund for Marianne's father. Their marriage would prove to be everything the dramatic courtship had promised. Lord Jonathan's restless energy found outlet in political reform, particularly in colonial matters where his experience gave him unique authority. Marianne, freed from the constraints of maiden propriety, became his partner in every sense, hosting salons where progressive ideas could be discussed, supporting his sometimes dangerous work with courage that matched his own. They would face challenges. Marcus Warren would attempt one last scheme from his hiding place in the Americas. Former associates from the Caribbean would occasionally threaten their peace, but they would face them together, their bond strengthened by every trial overcome. In their library at Blackwood House, among volumes of poetry and politics, would sit a slim journal bound in blue leather. In it, Marianne would record their story, not as society gossip would tell it, but as it truly was. A tale of two people who had found in each other not just love but recognition, not just passion but partnership, not just romance but reality. Years later, when their children asked how they had met and married, Marianne would smile and say it began with a waltz at a ball, like any proper society romance. But Jonathan would add, with that characteristic gleam in his gray eyes, that the best love stories were never quite proper, never quite safe, and never quite what they seemed on the surface. Their love had been tested by deception, threatened by danger, nearly destroyed by sacrifice, and shocked by revelations that would have shattered a weaker bond. Yet it had emerged stronger for the trials, proven by adversity, refined by truth. In an age of marriages made for convenience, theirs stood as testament to the power of choosing love despite its inconveniences. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, even through the most elaborate deceptions, even when faced with the revelation of secrets that would destroy a weaker bond. The triumph of Lord Jonathan and his Mary Anne reminds us that the greatest love stories are not those without obstacles, but those where love proves stronger than any impediment fate or a vengeful twin can devise.